Hey, hi, hello. Thank you so much for clicking. Let's talk about my favorite books this year. Before I sat down and filmed this, I was thinking about 2023. Honestly, this year was phenomenal. This year was so good. I had such a good time. I did so many amazing things. I saw so many amazing pieces of art live. I went on a massive road trip. I finished a draft. I hit 1,000 subscribers on this here internets. I'm just so happy. So let's get into it. Let's talk about books. I read over 1,000 books this year. No, I read over 100 books this year, and the year is not over yet. I feel like I'm in a pretty good place to list my favorites. First and foremost, I do not rate my books. I was inspired by Allison Pages here on YouTube to stop doing that. I find my experiences with books to be far more complex and nuanced than a simple 5-digit rating system. The whole process doesn't really work for me. It doesn't sum up my experiences with books. I think that how I feel about a certain piece of art at any given time is completely arbitrary. And sometimes I found I was rating a book 3 out of 5 stars, and then I would look back and be like, no, it was actually 5 out of 5. I don't really trust myself is what I'm saying. So I've stopped doing it because I'm pretty easy to please when it comes to books. The only time you will ever hear me reference a star rating is if a book is actually a 5 out of 5, a new favorite, a life-changing read. One of those very rare experiences where your entire experience is just elevated to that level of obsession with a book. That's the only time you're going to hear me talk about a 5-star rating. Okay, enough blabbering. Let's get into it. Actually, that's a lie. I'm going to blabber a little bit more because I do have a few honorary mentions that I really want to talk about. I tried to keep this list as short as possible. I ended up having 13 because that is my lucky number, but I wanted to call out a few other books that are not on this list. I reread War and Peace this year. I love that book. That is one of my all-time favorite books. I also read all of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and I have experienced that story before. I've read The Hobbit a few times. As much as I love Tolkien, he is also not on this list. And finally, I reread The Haunting of Hill House in the summertime, and I absolutely love Shirley Jackson, but she's also not on this list because I've read that. It was really hard to narrow down this list. I feel like I could have talked for 47 hours straight about all of the books that I read this year. I didn't include some of the books that I really wanted to talk about. I read some amazing books by Canadian authors this year. Icefields, The River Twice. I also read the Six of Crows duology, which I'm not including on this list because I've read Six of Crows at least twice. This was my third reread, I think, and I finished that series and it was devastating. But I didn't count it because there were just so many other books to talk about. I also fell in love with Virginia Woolf's writing. I read To the Lighthouse. I really just want to read more from her. Finally, I read Hemingway. I read A Farewell to Arms, and I was reminded about how much I love that man's writing. I really do want to read more from him in 2024. So those are all the honorary mentions. Let's get into the actual list of the 13 best books I read this year. So these are kind of in order, but also kind of not. Really just kept to the best 2 for last because those really were my favorites. All the other ones are kind of just floating in a cloud together. Okay, so the 13th book, or the number 1 book that I'm going to talk about, is Everybody in This Room Will Someday Be Dead by Emily Austen. I read this on my Kobo. This follows a highly anxious, death-obsessed lesbian who accidentally gets a job at a Catholic church and basically lives in fear that her identity is going to be exposed and she's going to lose her job. I went into this book expecting it to be really funny and maybe a little bit more lighthearted, but I was very surprised to find that this book deeply affected me. I struggle with my mental health, and while I was reading that book, I really just felt like it was accurately depicting what it is like to live with crippling anxiety. And it wasn't as fun as I thought it was going to be. It was uncomfortable, bordering painful, but the end was so cathartic, and I really enjoyed going on this journey with the main character. I think that if anyone is looking for an accurate depiction of what it's like to live with anxiety, that certainly is it, and it definitely is uncomfortable for those of us who just battle our brains every single day. The second book that I'm including on this list, I actually just read, so hello, that's amazing. I don't know what that was, but this is The Wicked Deep by Shay Earnshaw. This is a bind-up edition of both The Winterwood and The Wicked Deep. I'm basically including both of these on this list, but I just like The Wicked Deep a little bit more. Impeccable when it comes to atmosphere. You want a good atmospheric read? Pick up these books. And I love atmospheric reads. I think that if a book has a brilliant atmosphere, I'm really usually going to enjoy my time. I couldn't stop thinking about The Wicked Deep while I was reading it. I was looking forward to reading it when I was not reading it. I was using it as a treat at the end of the day to get through the days of intense studying. Both of these books feature a storyline of modern day witches set in really vivid settings, really vivid natural settings that are their own characters in many ways. The plots of both of these books were quite predictable. I did guess the ending pretty much for both of them, but I didn't really mind because they were just safe and easy to read, and they had this tension throughout both of them that I really, really enjoyed. So 10 out of 10 for atmosphere. I'm not going to be able to hold both of these books at the same time. I don't know what I was thinking. So next on the list, or the 12th best book of the year, is anything by Chuck Wendig that I read this year. So I read The Book of Accidents by Chuck Wendig first, and then I also read Black River Orchard by Chuck Wendig. And oh my goodness, he is a new favorite modern author. I will read anything by him. Much like last year, I discovered Frederick Bachman and fell in love. This year, I feel like I really just found Chuck Wendig, and it's so exciting to find an author that you are just like, yes, I'm gonna buy everything that they write. It's just nice to have those authors that you can fall back on and rely on when you just want a good book that will just be easy to read and get you through your days. I loved both The Book of Accidents and Black River Orchard. Both are horror stories featuring families, and what they do and what Chuck Wendig does really well that I enjoyed is he takes traditional tropes like a haunted house or like a cult style story and expands on them so they feel both nostalgic but new, and I love when horror stories do that. They were immensely readable, they had exciting plots, and I really just think that he shines with his characters. The characters felt real, I was rooting for them. Where he shines though is his writing. I think Black River Orchard, the very beginning, has some of the best writing I've read this year from a modern contemporary author. Were they perfect? Not entirely. The Book of Accidents had a little bit of a cheesy ending. It got a little cheesy towards the end, but I can't fault him for that. And Black River Orchard dragged on ever so slightly. But to be honest, I'm just really happy to find another reliable buy author. Definitely be looking into him in future spooky seasons. So the next book on this list is The Secret History by Donna Tartt. This book is placed on this list solely due to the power of the writing. I went into this book with a bit of a chip on my shoulder. I will admit, this book had a lot to prove for me. I was expecting it to be so pretentious that I would just hate it, because I really don't like when I feel like artists are talking down to you when you are trying to experience their art. And Donna Tartt has that a little bit in her writing. There's a little bit of condescension throughout this story. However, she writes really well, and this story was phenomenal. And I can see why this is a favorite book for a lot of people. I just want to say I don't mind pretension. I can accept it. I can embrace it even, but the work really does have to live up to it, and this one did. And it lived up to the hype. There's so much hype around this book. It wasn't just well written, but the pace was also really, really good. Again, I did have some gripes with it. I didn't love the way all of the characters were written, and I also feel like there were some plot points that were so unnecessary and long-winded. From what I remember, I really enjoyed the first half of this book way more than the second half. I think the second half dragged on ever so slightly. But overall, I get the hype. I'm very glad that I've read it. I really do like the dark academia genre, and obviously I had to read this one in order to truly say that. Next up is another combo by the same author, another beloved author. I only have one of the books. The other one I have on my Kobo because I actually read it during my trip, and that is both Bunny and Rouge by Mona Awad. I loved both Bunny and Rouge. I loved them for different reasons. Suffice to say, Mona Awad is definitely a new favorite storyteller for me. As I said, I read Bunny during my road trip, and it was just so nice to have a book to look forward to reading on the plane because I'm terrified of plane rides. And so it was really distracting. For Bunny, the characters really stood out for me, and I really did like the story. I did not love the ending. For Rouge, I loved the plot and the themes here. We are talking about themes surrounding youth and beauty, the things that we inherit from our mothers as women, the beauty industry at large, and I loved the ending of this book. Both books certainly feel like fever dreams. The absolute chaos that is Awid's storytelling and plots just get me every single time. Both of these reads were completely buck wild, and I'm so excited for her next book. The next book is actually an audiobook, and I'm really glad that I read the audiobook. This is also another instant buy author, and that is Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. There are very few writers in this day and age that can cross genres as successfully as Kuang has been able to do. Yellowface proved to me that she is a master storyteller. Before I go on, I just want to say I've read Babel, loved it so much. I have not read the Poppy War trilogy. I'm actually asking for it for Christmas, and I think I'm gonna get it. Really want to read it over the Christmas break. Okay, so back to Yellowface. After a deadly accident kills her friend, June, our main character in Yellowface, steals her unpublished manuscript and publishes it as her own. This book deals with themes of racism and cancel culture, and it really takes on the publishing industry as a whole. Much like The Secret History, this book also had something to prove for me, but obviously for a different reason. So I used to work in the publishing industry. It's something that I've mentioned, but I don't really talk about my time there. I am deeply passionate about the publishing industry. I could talk forever about it. But one thing I will say is that I find authors and artists in general tend to not get the publishing industry correct. The author's experience of the publishing industry is a small corner of the industry as a whole, and often what happens is they take their experience, which is valid and true. I'm not saying that their experiences are not true, but they're just such a small part of the industry. And they take that experience and they paint the entire industry with that experience. An example of this would be a best-selling author who paints the industry as super glamorous and filled with CEOs that drink whiskey and have parties late into the night and schmooze and dinner authors and things like that. And I was expecting Kuang to not paint an accurate depiction. Whatever the depiction that she was going to pick, I was like, I don't know that it's going to be entirely accurate. But she does this masterful thing where she takes her experiences and they feel universal. And she's really, really good at objective storytelling. And honestly, I didn't think that she was going to be able to paint a nuanced and very accurate depiction of the modern day publishing industry, and she nailed it. She nailed it so hard. All of the problems were entirely accurate and painted in such an accurate way. How many times am I going to say the word accurate? But it was just very, very surprising to me. I'm so glad that she took on the publishing industry the way that she did, because I don't think a lot of people could have done that. And I think it speaks to her brilliance and her observation as an artist. And that's not a skill that many artists have, and she seems to have it. And I think that's what makes her so good at crossing genres. But of course, it's not just that I loved about this book. As always, as I've found with her writing, the plot is just so tight and phenomenal and fast-paced and riveting. And I really did enjoy listening to the audiobook because it was really fun hearing the main character's June. It was really fun hearing her voice. Overall, for just the super, super smart writing that was nuanced and just brilliant, superb, delightful, I really just enjoyed it. And again, I'm just falling in love with authors really hard this year, and I'm not sorry for it. The next book, keep in mind again, none of these books are really like in order of how I enjoyed them. So this is going to seem like it's coming out of left field, but just keep in mind that none of these books again are in order. It's not like I preferred this book over Yellowface or anything, but it's like such a weird random diversion, but also probably not. Anywho, I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop. Okay, the next book is Animal by Lisa Taddeo. This book just stuck inside my brain and it continues to live there now, and I read it months and months ago. In Animal, we explore trauma and female rage. It's gritty, it's uncomfortable, it is something that you just cannot look away from. This follows Joan, who suffers a very traumatic event and deals with the aftermath of that in the sweltering heat of California, just outside of LA. This year was really the year for unhinged women in my books, and I really, really enjoyed that. Not only did I enjoy the themes in this story, but I also just liked the way that they were explored and presented. This felt like a car wreck that you couldn't look away from. Yeah, I think I just really explored horrible women this year, and I'm not apologizing for that. I really, really love depictions of female rage. The only other thing I will say is if this does sound intriguing to you, obviously read the trigger warnings because this is a very disturbing book. That's also true with any book that I talk about, but that one in particular, just trigger warnings for sure. But fantastically written, just loved the whole ride, and I still think about that book now. Next up, I have an audiobook that I listened to, My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. I listened to this book while I was preparing for my trip, so I was doing a ton of cleaning and packing, and I just had it on in the background, and it made the time go by so quickly. You know, when you're waiting for a vacation and you're counting down the literal hours and days, this book made it fly by. I also read this book with a friend, and I'm really glad that I did because I was able to talk about it with someone, which I think that this book is the type of book that I needed to. Painful and raw, this book follows a relationship between a young teenager and her teacher. It explores the psychological impact of abuse and the manipulative dynamic of a predatory relationship. So it's a very, very intense book to read, but it is done so well, in my opinion. The pace locks you in to its grasp and it will not let go. I think my favorite review of this book is from Roxane Gay on Goodreads, and I'm gonna link it down below because I feel like she really explores this book in a way that I don't think I could possibly articulate as well. So I'm going to link that down below, but this book, I'm very glad that I read it. I think it's an incredibly important read, and I do think that the story was done well. Next book, completely changing gears. I mean, kind of, again, all of the books feature unhinged women or women going through trauma. It's real. I swear I had a good year, but I guess I was just really drawn to that this year. The next book that I'm going to talk about is Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk. And this book is one of those books that when I finished it, I was kind of like, meh. But now that I've thought about it and now that I've had time to process it, I loved this book. Really and truly loved this book. The things that I loved about this book, the themes of animal rights and animal autonomy, human relationships with fate and justice, and our overall purpose in this world. I loved the character's voice. I loved the natural setting, and I loved the mystery surrounding the plot. There was this mixture of joy and anger throughout this story that just really stuck with me. I let this story simmer pretty much all year, and I still think about moments and quotes, and I feel like that is a sign of a really good story. And ultimately, I think if I was in school for literature, I would definitely want to write about this book because the themes alone really spoke to me. The next book on this list is The Book Thief. I can't believe I sat on this book for so long. I'm so glad that I read it this year. I'm so glad to have read this book. I'm sure that there's going to be some of you that are utterly pleased that this book is on this list because this is so many people's favorite book. I can see why. I can totally see why. I was intimidated to give it a try just because of the high expectations that I had for this book, but oh my goodness, it surpassed them. They were met, they were exceeded. It was the writing that really shined in this story. It took this incredibly complex and dark plot and molded it into this compelling and heartbreaking and intimate story. I definitely sobbed a number of times throughout this book. The writing just really hit my heart so hard, and I can see why this is listed as one of the top books in the World War II genre. I think it's a unique approach to it. I can see young Megan reading this story for school during a World War II unit and absolutely loving it. I found Death being a narrator in this book to be fascinating and really well done, and I deeply enjoyed the themes of German guilt throughout this story. I thought that that was also really well done, and there is a moment, I'm not going to spoil anything, but there's a moment in a bomb shelter where the narration steps back, and it is some of the most harrowing pieces of writing I think I've read on World War II, and I just think it was really, really well done. I have not seen the movie yet. I will. Okay, top three. Are you ready? Excited about this one. I really liked all three of these books so much. Number 3 of the best books I've read this year is A Dowy of Blood by S.T. Gibson. I read this book during my 24-hour readathon that I did a few videos ago in October. I'm really sad that I sat on this book for so long. It is a short, searing story that follows a bride of Dracula. It explores themes of abuse, obsession, consent, and eternal life. It is gothic. It is captivating, enthralling. I feel like I was under the spell of Dracula throughout these pages. I also had such a visceral reaction to this story, and that very rarely happens to me. I felt this story throughout my body. I was deeply uncomfortable throughout reading these pages. And when a story can move me that way, I think it's a phenomenal story. And I think that that's a phenomenal achievement. And that is why this book is top 3 for me. I was on edge the entire time reading it. And even if I wasn't reading this for a 24-hour readathon, I really do think I would have sat and read this book in one sitting because I just could not stop. I couldn't stop. I was hypnotized by it. It's the type of story that just lingers on the tongue long after you are done, and I still feel the way I felt when reading this story. So good. Okay, the second best book I read this year. Definitely a new favorite. I read this at the very beginning of the year, and when I was looking through my Goodreads list, trying to remember all the books I read, I knew that this was going to be top 2 for sure, because it is hands down the best fiction I've read this year. This is The Snow Child by Eowyn Ivey, and oh my goodness. This will likely not mean anything to you, but while I was reading this book, I texted my best friend that this book feels like a love child between me and her. This book is set in the 1920s Alaska, and we follow a married couple who is growing apart through the struggles of trying to develop a homestead in brutal Alaska, and also their yearning for a child. They are unable to conceive year after year, and the disappointment grows. And one night during a snowstorm, in a moment of complete joy, they decide to build a snow child out of snow. And the next morning, all of the snow is gone, and they see a young girl in the woods. And thus begins a lifelong journey with this child who they're not sure is real or not. This book had absolutely everything that I love in a book. It had an incredibly powerful nature setting that feels like its own character. It had historical elements that just transported me to a different time. A love story that wove through the entire book and just felt so sweet and wholesome and real because it wasn't all perfect. Finally, it had those magical elements that just tickle my imagination in the best way possible. It really did feel like reading a fairy tale done so well. Oh my gosh, my hand's getting numb, so I'm going to move it over this way. It was historical with a touch of fairy tale, and it was incredibly heartwarming from start to finish. It was actually both heart-wrenching and heartwarming, which again is just some of my favorite stories have that balance. Honestly, when I was writing my notes for this, I immediately wanted to read it again. This book sat on just my favorites list, but I think it's going to move to my all-time 5 out of 5 life-changing reads because this book was just so good. That's why it is the top 2. Finally, the number 1 book, my favorite book that I've read all year. It is a massive surprise to me. It may be a massive surprise to you. I was not expecting this book to affect me the way that it did, but it did, and I am happy to report that my favorite book of this year is surprisingly a nonfiction book, and that is Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Art of Sylvia Plath by Heather Clark. Pause for applause. Now, I believe that there is magic to books, and I don't think that that's going to surprise anyone if you've made it this far, if you've been watching my videos. If you are a reader, I'm sure you also agree that there is a special kind of magic to books. There is power to stories, and that power can manifest itself in so many different ways. You can have increased empathy and understanding of others. The power of seeing yourself in a character or in pages and feeling seen. There's falling in love with a setting that just feels like it transports you there and takes you out of your own world for a little bit. There are books and stories that just feel like a safe place for your heart. Those are all magical elements to stories. But one of the most magical things for me is when a story feels like it just finds you at the right time in your life and alters the way that you view the world. And this book, Red Comet by Heather Clark, found its way to me in the most unlikely way, in the most coincidental way, that I can't help but feel like there was a little bit of magic in the world in that moment. A little story. I loved Sylvia Plath's writing. I love her writing, but I loved her writing in high school. She was one of my first influences. I was greatly influenced by this woman who I felt could write her ass off about incredibly difficult feelings like depression, and I really felt myself in her words. I read her first, I think, when I was 15 or 16, and I got her words tattooed on me the moment I turned 18 because she just really had a huge impact on me. The way she writes just spoke to my core in such an intense way that I don't think I'll ever be able to articulate the impact that Plath's writing had on my life. Fast forward a little bit, I started to struggle quite intensely with my mental health. And so I put Plath's writing aside. All throughout my young adult life, my early 20s, I really wanted to reread her again because I know how much I loved her and how much her work meant to me, but I just couldn't because she speaks about depression and mental health in such a vivid, intense way that I knew it would affect me and I knew it would impact me quite negatively. So I put down her work, always meaning to return to it, always holding love for it, but knowing that it just wasn't safe for me in that mental state. Enter this year. I was doing significantly better. I am doing significantly better. Was in a really, really good place. And earlier this year in February, I was visiting my best friend in Ottawa, and she took me on a bookstore tour in Ottawa where we went to like 7 different independent bookstores. And at each bookstore, I bought a couple books, and it was so much fun, and I love her for it. It was such a good day. I had bought so many books that by the time we ended our tour at the Canadian bookstore chain Indigo, I had decided that I was done. I wasn't going to buy any more books. Another thing that I just want to add really quickly to this story is that one of my goals that I randomly set for myself in 2023 was to read more nonfiction. Just an arbitrary goal that I was like, how can I challenge myself with reading? And I picked reading more nonfiction because I haven't actually read a whole lot of nonfiction in the past few years, and I wanted to get back into that. So keep that in mind. So we're walking around Indigo, and I'm kind of just following my friend because I no longer want to buy books and I'm not looking for any books for myself. And we end up in the poetry section, and this book is just sitting on an empty shelf. Like someone just discarded it. It's in the wrong section. It's faced out though, and I pick it up. And I go back and forth on whether or not I would even read this book because it is 900 pages. It is a massive, massive tome. And I wasn't sure if I was going to really like it because it's about someone's life. I know that that life is deeply troubled, and I really hemmed and hawed for a very long time. And then I saw the price, and this book is $26 Canadian, $20 US for a 900-page nonfiction book. And I knew in that moment I was going to bring it home. And oh my gosh, am I glad that I did. Because this book, if you haven't noticed, is phenomenal. It would be phenomenal even if I didn't already have a connection to Sylvia Plath's writing. I feel like this sets a standard for biography writing that I've never experienced before. It is so high. What Heather Clark did in this biography, I've never seen in another biography. I've never seen in nonfiction. She made Sylvia Plath feel so three-dimensional that I felt like I was reading fiction. Through a combination of Plath's own words and Clark's incredibly insightful analysis of her work, I felt like I walked away with a complete portrait of someone. And I don't really understand how Clark did that because it's incredible. It is such a feat. This is the only nonfiction book that has ever made me cry, and that speaks to Clark's storytelling. The way that she was able to weave facts into this incredible narrative. This is a masterclass on the biography genre. Felt like I was able to experience the writing of one of my favorite writers for the first time again and read my favorite book for the first time again, which is a feeling we all strive for as readers. And this book gave me that chance, and I never in my life have experienced that feeling before, and it is so good, let me tell you. It is so well balanced too. It is sympathetic to Plath, but it is not forgiving, or there are no excuses for Plath. She just made Sylvia Plath feel like a real person with deep flaws going through her life and making choices, and it was so good. It inspired me and it moved me, and maybe it didn't alter the trajectory of my life like so many other books have. You know, I can't necessarily say that this book changed my life, but it kind of did in its own special way. It made me feel that ever so rare feeling of complete and total elation experiencing a wonderful work of art does. And that's special and that's magical, and that's the magic of books. I'm not ending on that note, but that is all I have to say about that book, because it is just so good, and it's not going to be for everyone. I'm sure if you're not at all interested in Sylvia Plath, or if you really don't like her, because she does rub some people the wrong way, that's fair. You might not like it, but if you are a fan of the biography genre, this is it. This is definitely it. I actually want to look up what it lost the Pulitzer Prize to, because it was a finalist, and oh my gosh, it deserves that. Okay, that's it. That's all. I've talked for so long about books, and I'm sure I could talk even longer, but thank you so much for being here. Thank you if you're still watching this video. As I said, 2023 was such a wonderful year for me, and one of the best parts was making these silly little videos on the internet. So thank you so much for being a part of that, and let me know, based on my random list of best books of 2023, what books you think I would really like to read, because I have no concept of what my reading taste is. And I love getting book suggestions. Let me know what books were your favorites of this year as well. And also let me know the last book that has moved you in the way that Red Comet moved me. And until next time, thank you so much for watching. Bye!